Chapter 12. It All Comes Tumbling Down. January, March 1917. The Nobility's Petrograd. In the weeks following Rasputin's death, the weather turned bitter cold. At times, the mercury dropped to 50 below zero in Petrograd, and drifts of snow buried railroad cars and supply depots, making delivery of desperately needed goods impossible. With millions of peasants fighting instead of working in the fields, food shortages loomed and prices soared. A loaf of black bread cost 3 times as much as it had at the start of the war. A pound of potatoes 8 times as much. Rents tripled, even as thousands of workers found themselves unemployed, their factories shut for lack of coal. Fewer and fewer people could afford even the most basic necessities, even if those items could be found in the city. Still, the nobility's palaces blazed with light. Music still floated from their ballrooms, and lavish midnight suppers of cold sturgeon, stuffed eggs, and rose cream cakes were still laid out temptingly in elegant dining rooms. Jewels glittered, gold braid dazzled, and both champagne and laughter bubbled up as party-goers discussed the latest craze in card games and the shocking price of caviar. Above all, they gossiped about Rasputin's murder. Had they heard about the Staryet's private funeral in a secluded corner of the imperial park at Tsarskoye Selo? They asked one another. Besides, the royal family, only Anna Vrubova had attended. The Tsar and Alexei had traveled all the way from Stavka to be there. Before closing the coffin, the Grand Duchesses had placed an icon on Rasputin's chest, their tears falling on the oak casket. Alexandra, too, had left behind a token, a pitiful little note that read, "My dear martyr, give me thy blessing, that it may follow me always on the sad and dreary path I have yet to follow here below. And remember us from on high in your holy prayers. Alexandra." Members of the nobility expressed shock over the harsh punishment given to Rasputin's murderers. Incredibly, Nicholas had ordered his own cousin, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, to leave Petrograd and join the Russian army, and Yusupov, the man married to the Tsar's dearest niece, had been exiled to one of his huge estates in the center of the country. Only Purishkevich had been lucky. He went free, not because he wasn't guilty, but because he'd become such a big hero in the Duma that even the Tsar was afraid to punish him. No one seemed to know what happened to Dr. Lazovert or Officer Sukhotin. Instead of returning to Stavka after the funeral, the Tsar remained in Tsarskoye Selo. People who had seen him claimed he acted tired and confused. Said one minister, "He listened to me with a strange, almost vacant smile, glancing nervously about him. When asked a question, he was reduced to a state of helplessness. For a long time he looked at me in silence, as if trying to collect his thoughts or recall what had escaped his memory." All these rumors were true. Suddenly unable to make any decisions at all, Nicholas simply stared for hours on end at the battlefield maps he'd spread out on his pool table. So changed was he that many people claimed Alexandra was giving him drugs. But Ambassador Paleolo knew better. The Emperor's words, his silences, his grave, drawn features, and vague, distant thoughts confirm in me the notion that Nicholas II feels himself overwhelmed by events, and is now resigned to disaster. Even though the Tsar was back in the palace, Alexandra remained in control of the government. Rumor had it that the palace's main telephone was removed from Nicholas's desk and put in her lilac drawing room, and ministers' reports were still handed to her. Some claimed she'd even taken to eavesdropping on her husband's conversations with advisors and generals, hiding behind thick velvet curtains on a balcony located just above the Tsar's study. Later, she gave Nicholas her opinions. Remarked Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna at one of the nobility's many parties that winter. "It seems the empress has the emperor entirely under her thumb. I can't tell you how downhearted I feel. Everything seems black. I badly need sun and rest. The emotions of recent times have worn me out." The workers. If Maria Pavlovna had bothered to look out her palace window, she would have seen others far more worn out than herself. Thousands of poor working women shivered in the sub-zero temperatures outside Petrograd's bakeries. They often stood in line all night for a loaf of bread, just to be told in the morning that there would not be any for sale because there wasn't any flour. But what else was there? A worker could buy little else because of shortages and exorbitant prices. These exhausted mothers, noted one policeman, having suffered so much in watching their half-starving and sick children are perhaps closer to revolution than anyone else, and more dangerous. Meanwhile, their husbands wandered the snow-packed streets, bellies grumbling, their expressions dark and angry. They complained about the lack of food, the war, and a government that did not care about its people. More and more workers began marching behind banners that read, "Down with the war." The city recalled Ambassador Paleolo, now struck him as a lunatic asylum filled with a poisonous atmosphere and profound despondency and fear. The danger of revolution was growing. Indeed, a police report from this time stamped "top secret" noted that the food shortages, combined with an inflation rate of 300%, had pushed the country to the edge of rebellion. If something dramatic wasn't done to avert it immediately, a hungry revolt was bound to happen, followed by the most savage excesses. If Nicholas read this report, he did not respond, and in the Duma, yet another deputy stood. This time it was Alexander Kerensky, an outspoken champion of the worker. To prevent a catastrophe, he cried, the Tsar himself must be removed by force, if there is no other way. Only months earlier, Kerensky's words would have landed him in jail. A man of the government was advocating the Tsar's overthrow. But in the dark mood now gripping Petrograd, his speech did not seem out of the ordinary. Kerensky was simply saying out loud what so many others were thinking. Last-ditch effort. On February 10, 1917, the Tsar's old friend and cousin, Sandro, made a final effort to ward off disaster. Traveling to Tsarskoye Selo, he insisted on speaking with Alexandra. He was shown into her bedroom. The empress reclined on one side of the big double bed in a white dressing robe. With her lips pressed tightly together, she looked cold and angry. On the other side of the bed sat the Tsar, his slippered feet crossed on the satin comforter, smoking silently. Sandro spoke bluntly, beginning with the people's grim mood. But Alexandra interrupted him. "That's not true. The nation is still loyal to the Tsar." She turned to Nicholas. "Only the treacherous Duma and St. Petersburg society are our enemies." Sandro corrected her. "I am your friend, and so I point out to you that all classes of the population are opposed to your policies. Please, Alex, leave the cares of state to your husband." Alexandra's eyes narrowed. Nicholas continued to smoke, and Sandro went on. The only way to end the nation's wrath was to immediately appoint leadership acceptable to the people. That meant removing all of Rasputin's suspicion-provoking ministers and replacing them with men of talent and ability. "Don't let the nation's wrath reach the explosion point," he begged. Alexandra bristled. "All this talk of yours is ridiculous." "Remember, Alex," snapped Sandro, struggling to keep the anger out of his voice. "I remained silent for 30 months. For 30 months I never said a word to you about the disgraceful goings-on in our government. Better to say your government. I realize you are willing to perish, and your husband feels the same, but what about us?" Alexander did not reply. "Must we all suffer for your blind stubbornness?" Sandro exploded. "No, you have no right to drag your relatives down with you. You are incredibly selfish." "I refuse to continue this dispute," said Alexander coldly. "You are exaggerating the dangers. Someday, when you are less excited, you will admit that I knew better." Remaining silent, Nicholas lit another cigarette. Sandro realized there was nothing more to say. "It's enough to drive you mad," he later wrote his brother. "Up here at Tsarskoye Selo, it's like water off a duck's back. All is submission to God. How else can I explain such total blindness and deafness? The Tsar has ceased to rule Russia." Revolution and the resting Tsar. 3 weeks later, on Thursday, March 8, 1917, the women on breadlines snapped, shouting, "Dajte chleb," "Give us bread." They broke into the bakeries and cleared out the shelves. Masses of angry factory workers quickly joined the women, marching toward the center of town, chanting, "Dajte chleb, dajte chleb." The mob broke windows, halted streetcars, and urged others to join them. While all this was happening, Nicholas's train was carrying him back to Stavka. As he chugged eastward, he blithely wrote to his wife, "I will miss my half-hourly game of cards every evening, but vow to take up dominoes again in my spare time." In Petrograd the next day, even bigger crowds flowed into the streets. Again they chanted, "Give us bread." This time, though, shouts of "Down with the war" and "Down with the Tsar" were mixed in. Moving as one, the mob headed for the center of the city. That's when 2 squadrons of Cossack patrols moved in to disperse them. But because the Cossacks sided with the workers, they came without whips, the weapon they traditionally used when controlling mobs. Seeing this, the crowd applauded. The Cossacks gallantly bowed in return. "Don't worry," they assured the crowd. "We won't shoot." At Stavka, Nicholas gave little attention to reports streaming in from Petrograd. Instead, he noted that the fresh air was doing him good. "My brain is resting here," he wrote to Alexandra. "No ministers, no troubling questions or demanding thought." Back in Petrograd, his ministers faced huge new problems. By Saturday, March 10th, most of the city's workers were on strike, bringing the capital to a standstill. Electricity and water were shut off. Immense crowds of strikers, housewives, and college students crammed the streets. Unfurling revolutionary red banners, they screamed, "Down with the war! Down with the German woman!" They hurled rocks and chunks of ice at police. Frantically, the ministers tried to deal with it all. They wrestled with the food problem, hoping the promise of more bread would disperse the crowd. They telegrammed Nicholas and begged him to return, believing that the sight of the Tsar might end the violence. They even offered their resignations, urging Nicholas to replace them with a government more acceptable to the people. But at Stavka, Nicholas continued to rest his brain. After a late breakfast, he listened to an army staff report, then took an afternoon stroll. It wasn't until early evening that he learned of the situation in Petrograd, but he still did not grasp its seriousness. Believing it was just another strike in a long line of strikes, he refused to return to the capital or accept his ministers' resignations. As for more bread, feeding revolutionaries was out of the question. There was only one way to suppress the rebellion. He sent a stern telegram to his military chief in Petrograd. "I command you tomorrow to stop the disorders in the capital, which are unacceptable in the difficult time of war with Germany and Austria." The Tsar's order meant that he would be unleashing soldiers with rifles and machine guns on his own people. This at a time when he still expected their support in waging a war against Germany and Austria-Hungary, and he did not have the slightest idea he'd just taken such a drastic step. Instead, he believed Alexandra's description of the events. "It's a hooligan movement," she wrote him, "young boys and girls running about and screaming that they have no bread, only to excite. But this will all pass and quiet down." As the pale wintry sun washed over Petrograd that Sunday morning, March 11th, the first demonstrators moved into the streets. Posters hung overnight by the police met them. The posters forbade them from assembling. By command of the Tsar, strikers, they warned, would be forcefully disbanded. Demonstrators ignored the warning. Again, they surged through the streets, chanting and waving banners. In response, columns of soldiers closed in on them. An officer ordered the crowd to halt. When it didn't, he gave the command, "Fire." Machine guns crackled. When they stopped, workers' blood reddened the snow. 200 lay dead, and 40 were wounded. The sight sickened the soldiers, most of whom were just country boys fresh from their villages. Not only did these young men understand the demonstrators' frustrations, they sympathized with them, and so as the crowd continued to surge, many troops emptied their rifles into the air. One company even refused to fire. When their enraged commanding officer insisted they aim for the heart, they shot him instead. Encouraged by the soldiers' actions, the crowd grew larger, louder, and angrier. Desperate, Duma President Radzienko sent Nicholas a frantic telegram. "The hungry, unemployed throng is starting down the path of elemental and uncontrollable anarchy. State authority is totally paralyzed. Your Majesty, save Russia. She is threatened with humiliation and disgrace. Urgently summon a person in whom the whole country can have faith and entrust him with the formation of a government that all the people trust. In this terrible hour, there is no other way out, and to delay is impossible." But when the telegram arrived, Nicholas didn't even bother to read it. Setting it aside, he said, "That fat Radzienko has written all sorts of nonsense to me, to which I shall not even reply," and he spent the rest of the evening playing dominoes. Ignited. Monday, March 12th, dawned in eerie silence. Muriel Buchanan, daughter of the British ambassador, looked out her window. Everywhere were the same wide streets, the same great palaces, the same gold spires and domes rising out of the pearl-colored mists. And yet, everywhere emptiness. No lines of toiling cars, no crowded scarlet trams, no little sledges, only the waste of deserted streets and ice-bound river, and, on the opposite shore, the walls of the fortress and the imperial flag of Russia that for the last time fluttered against the winter sky. Suddenly there came a loud roar, and a mob of demonstrators appeared, armed and ready to fight with the Tsar's soldiers. They rushed for one of the bridges. At that moment, a regiment stormed toward them. It looked as if there would be a violent collision, recalled one eyewitness, but instead the two groups became one. The Tsar's army had joined the revolution. Now events moved quickly. Together, citizens and soldiers seized the arsenal, arming themselves with the guns and ammunition that had been stored for the capital's protection. Soon, men and women draped in cartridge belts and carrying weapons raced down the street, firing wildly into the air. They flung open jails and set the prisoners free, looted shops and bakeries, torched police stations and other government buildings. When firemen arrived at these scenes, rather than fighting the blazes, they cheered and watched the structures burn. Distraught, the Tsar's younger brother, Grand Duke Michael, telephoned Stavka. Nicholas had to appoint a government acceptable to the people now. But the Grand Duke was not allowed to speak with Nicholas directly. Instead, he was forced to leave a message with one of the generals. "I see," said the general after Michael explained the dire situation. "Please wait while I speak with the Tsar." 40 long minutes later, the general called back. "The Emperor wishes to express his thanks," he told Michael. "He is leaving for Tsarskoye Selo, where he can confer with his wife, and will decide there." Nicholas still did not understand. Government ministers finally gave up. Adjourning themselves, they simply walked away. Duma President Rodzianko tried one last time. "Sire, do not delay," he telegrammed to Stavka. "This will mean the end of Russia. Inevitably, the dynasty will fall with it. Tomorrow will be too late." It was already too late. By mid-afternoon, the first crowd of workers and soldiers waving red flags and singing revolutionary songs arrived at the Tauride Palace, where the Duma was meeting. It was, wrote one historian, a motley, exuberant mob. There were soldiers tall and hot in their rough wool uniforms, students shouting exultantly, and a few gray-bearded old men just released from prison, their knees trembling, their eyes shining. They had come looking for a government that would be responsive to the people. Some deputies wavered. It would be illegal, they claimed, to assume the Tsar's powers without his permission. Shouldn't they cable and ask for his approval first? Otherwise, any government they formed would be illegitimate. But others, including Alexander Kerensky, the Duma member who just days earlier had called for the Tsar's removal, realized the ridiculousness of their argument. This was a revolution, and all revolutions are by definition illegal. Forcible uprisings against an established government. The people had swept away the Tsar's authority, and the only real power now lay with them. And as the hours passed, the capital was sinking deeper into anarchy. The people needed leadership. Kerensky turned to President Rodzianko. "Can I say the Duma is with them?" he asked. "That it stands at the head of the government?" Still loyal to the Tsar, Rodzianko vacillated, unsure of what to do. "I don't want to revolt," he admitted. "Take the power," advised another member. "If you don't, someone else will." Rodzianko had no choice. Russia would continue to burn if the Duma did not step up. Reluctantly, he addressed the crowd. The Duma accepts responsibility for the government. Then members got to work. Before the day was done, 12 deputies of the former Duma created what they called the Provisional Committee of Duma Members for the Restoration of Order and for the Relations with Individuals and Institutions, Provisional Government for short. It was meant as a temporary government, one that would restore order and end the revolutionary chaos, and it would rule only until a national constituent assembly could meet, where representatives from all across the country would decide on the type of government Russians would live under. Led by men from the nobility and the middle class, the provisional government hoped to establish a democracy modeled on England's government, with 2 houses of parliament and a fair court system. Many still wanted a Tsar, but one without any dictatorial power. On the very day the provisional government organized in the Tauride Palace, labor leaders, many of them just released from prison by the revolutionary mob, reorganized the Petrograd Soviet, forming a union of workers and soldiers. As night fell, representatives from both groups, one for every 1,000 workers and one from every company of Petrograd soldiers, arrived at the Soviet's first meeting. Held in another room of the Tauride Palace, the meeting swelled to 3,000 delegates, many of them still toting rifles. The Petrograd Soviet saw the goals of the revolution far differently from the provisional government. Power, it believed, had not been wrestled from the Tsar so that the nobility and the middle class could simply rule the workers through another form of government. No, the revolution had been fought for the people, the poor, and the marginalized. The Soviet was an organization to be reckoned with. Among its many members were railroadmen enabling the Soviet to stop trains whenever it wanted, bank clerks so that it could control the flow of money, and soldiers who could carry out the Soviet's will. Members of the provisional government, most especially Alexander Kerensky, knew they needed the Soviet support to govern. Peeling off his formal morning coat and rolling up the sleeves of his starched dress shirt to look more like a man of the people, Kerensky strode down the hall to the Soviet meeting. "Comrades," he cried in a voice both fiery and dramatic, his bright, bird-like eyes looking out over the assembly, "I speak with all my soul from the bottom of my heart. The provisional government and the Soviet must come to settle side by side." The Soviet agreed. It would let the provisional government take the lead while it sat back as a kind of watchdog of the revolution. This fit in with Marxist political theory, which assumed that after a revolution, a backward peasant country like Russia needed a long period of capitalism and democracy before it could move toward a communist state. During this time, people would learn to relinquish what Marx had called their petty notions of small property. Additionally, a long period of capitalism would allow the illiterate, politically inexperienced masses time to gain knowledge before taking up government's reins. Until this happened, the leadership of the upper classes was essential. But the Soviet did not relinquish leadership without some concessions. The provisional government agreed, among other things, to abolish the police and in its place create a people's militia, to release all politicals still imprisoned or in exile, and to dissolve all the bureaucracy set up by the Tsar to run his government. These concessions had disastrous consequences. Eliminating bureaucratic institutions left the provisional government without an effective way to govern the country at a time when it desperately needed leadership. The well-intentioned provisional government would find itself unable to stop Russia from falling into even greater chaos. Meanwhile, at Stavka, completely unaware that his throne had toppled, Nicholas made plans to leave the next morning for Tsarskoye Selo. "Leave tomorrow, always near you, tender love to all," he telegrammed to Alexandra. Then he headed for bed. Beyond the palace gates, molecule in a storm. Juvenal Tarasov, a farmer from a nearby village, was visiting Petrograd on business when the revolution erupted. Soon afterward, he recalled his experiences for American journalist Ernest Poole, who was covering events in Russia for the new republic. Said Tarasov, "With a jubilant shout of freedom arising from every corner of the city, the long-expected revolution, which had gathered for 50 years, was suddenly upon us at last. Eagerly I burst out into the street and hurried to the palace square. I found it like a beehive, black with swarming thousands of people and soldiers. I made my way deep into the crowd, listening, watching, all my thoughts and feelings gripped by a force gigantic, like the world, but a new world. It was like a dream. Then suddenly I heard the word go round to burn the palace. At once I thought of the Hermitage, a public art museum which stood so close to the palace one could not burn without the other. The Hermitage, with its Rembrandts and all its other treasures of art. My father and I had been there often. The place had been like a holy cathedral, my only religion as a child, and now, as I stood in a trance, something strange happened inside of me, and what took place I cannot recall. I remember shouting to two men to hoist me up on their shoulders. Then I began to speak to the crowd, and as I noticed that thousands of eyes were turning in my direction, I seemed to lose all consciousness. Now I was speaking down to them from somewhere in the cloudy sky. When I regained my senses, I was lying on the pavement. There was cool, dirty snow on my face, and a soldier was on his knees beside me. The Winter Palace was not burned. I do not mean in the least to say that the Hermitage was saved by my speech. That doubtless played but one little part in the thoughts and passions deep and surging through such a multitude. I was simply a molecule in a storm.